Healers. The white mage, the medic. You know what I'm talking about. The guy that makes it so you don't die. RPGs of just about every variety have healers in some way, shape, or form, and, well, not even RPGs, but games in general have healing, healers, doctors, medics, white mages, or some sort of similar mechanic to make sure you, as a character, don't die, because dying is cringe, and you wouldn't want to be cringe. Of course, Honkai Star Rail is no different. Well, it is different, it's a degenerate pit of gambling and sin, but it's also different from several other degenerate gambling sin pits, or something thereabout, that it shares the space with. When Honkai Star Rail launched, it was a pretty big departure from the incredibly popular titan of the genre, Genshin Impact, which is of course made by the same company. While the in-game economy and gacha structure is mostly identical, being a turn-based RPG, that sets Star Rail apart, and not having Paimon talking every 5 seconds. That also, very importantly, sets Star Rail apart.
Paimon coming in! Paimon coming in! Is this level okay? Can you hear Paimon?
God, I hate Paimon. Since Star Rail is a turn-based game, there's no dodge mechanic like Genshin and other games in the space like Wuthering Waves, for the 5 people that are still playing Wuthering Waves. This means that having units that keep your team alive is all but required. In Genshin, you can opt to run a team with no shielding and healing and get by through dodging and using the iframes from ultimates and things like that. With healing and shielding being crucial to survival, surely then, when Honkai Star Rail launched, there were plenty of options that allowed you to keep your team alive and progress through content effectively. Right? Right? That's rhetorical, obviously. The answer is no. There were not plentiful options for keeping your team alive. There were shockingly few. Today I wanted to take the time to talk about the history of sustain units and how they fit into the puzzle that is Star Rail since its release. Let's start by just listing every sustain unit in the game at launch. This won't take long. March 7th is the first exception here, as she really just can't actually protect your team. She only shields one teammate at a time, and there isn't really many reliable ways to use Preservation March as a solo sustain. She did have some early synergies with characters like Clara, since her shield also provides taunt and Clara wants to be hit, which doesn't sound like a good thing, but it is, because she kills things when she gets hit, and that's neat. However, you would basically always need to run a healer as well if you were to try this, because, you know, you're still gonna die, and also everything in their grandma has AoE damage, so your one character being shielded isn't gonna help you that much. Preservation Trailblazer is a usable preservation unit, but far from perfect, and they become available after completing the main Belobog quest, which is a decent way through the content that was available in the first patch of the game. I know some people use them for a good while as a sustain, but I personally never really had much incentive to do so. That brings us to the only other truly free-to-play sustain at launch, Natasha. Natasha basically embodies what a sustain unit is meant to do. Sustain. Her skill, wait for it, heals, and her ult, well, you're going to be surprised by this one, heals. Her skill also fills the important role of being able to cleanse debuffs and crowd control effects from the target. Cleansing is kind of the second major function of most sustains, except Bailu. She just doesn't cleanse for reasons that I really don't understand. I mean, she's a 5-star, she doesn't have a cleanse. I don't know why. Keeping your damage dealer alive doesn't help if the character is unable to move, so having a cleanse is a very important part about what makes a sustain viable. When the game first launched, Natasha was one of the most valuable units on your account, despite being free. This is because she was one of the few units that had a cleanse, and also, by the way, made it so you didn't die. Both March and Bronya, for example, could cleanse as well, but they weren't going to keep your team alive nearly as effectively. And Bailu, who I very briefly mentioned earlier, was the only other abundance unit in the game, period. It was literally just Bailu and just Natasha. This meant that if you didn't get the standard 5-star Bailu from your beginner banner, you only had one healer in the game. And like I said, that one other healer does not have a cleanse. She could res a downed ally though once per battle, which is a plus I suppose, so that's your cleanse. Just, you know, if they get status, just let them die. The main issue with Bailu, though, is that being a standard 5-star, like I said, is that most of the player base didn't even have her, especially in 1.0. If you didn't have Bailu or Japard, the other standard 5-star sustain, you were very thin on ways to actually keep your team alive. Speaking of Japard, we can chat about him now, I guess, being one of the only preservation units in the game, period, not even just at launch. They just don't release preservation characters, like, ever. He and Bailu could both serve as very reliable sustains as standard 5-stars. Instead of healing like Bailu, though, Japard just tries to make a massive shield to protect your units from losing HP in the first place, which, for the most part, does work. But like I said, those are two standard 5-star characters, meaning that you really don't have access to both of them early on in the game. I mean, I doubt anyone had both of them in 1.0. I guess if you got one of them off of the beginner banner and then lost your first 50-50 to the other one, maybe you had both of them in the first patch of the game, but aside from that, you probably didn't. And just like that, we've covered every sustain unit in the game at launch. This lack of options was only worsened by the fact that damage dealers we had weren't nearly as, well, absurdly broken as the ones we have now, so you weren't really zero cycling any in-game content. On top of that, you weren't max level yet because you hadn't reached max account level yet, and then also, you didn't have broken relics, so you just weren't nearly as good in general. These days, some team comps can just kill things fast enough to where you don't have to worry so much about dying or having a sustain in the first place. That being said, that requires a large amount of investment and usually using some pretty busted units in the process. So sustains are still, of course, very, very important, as the overwhelming majority of players are going to be using them in their clears. Now, looking at this situation, you would imagine that the first premium sustain unit released to be very desirable. And at the time, he certainly was. And that'll definitely last, right? Locha was released in the version 1.1 patch, meaning the first real patch of the game. They decided, hey, maybe we should solve the problem of literally having no healers in the game. And being the only limited sustain in the game set him up to be a very high value pickup. However, Locha is one of the 5 stars to experience the most drastic drop-off in the field of public opinion. At least in my opinion, which I'm making this video public, so am I the public opinion? Am I the public? I have to think about this. Anyway, enough introspection. When Locha came out, he was a super good pickup for your account. I pulled him myself. On top of being a valuable sustain, he was skill point friendly and also had the ability to remove enemy buffs, which at the time was a valuable piece of utility because it allowed him to remove the self-res effect that Mars-struck enemies had, meaning you only had to kill them once for them to stay dead. Being able to heal outside of his own turn, removing buffs, and not using skill points, sounds like this uncomfortably attractive-looking man is set to be the cornerstone of your account for a long time. Yeah, no one likes him anymore. Locha falling off is really due to a couple reasons. Firstly, basically every sustain unit released after him has some sort of buffing or debuffing capability that helps the overall team damage in a meaningful way. And the second thing is that aside from the Mara-struck enemies that we talked about earlier, with their self-res buff, not a lot of enemies really need to have buffs dispelled in the first place. So that unique piece of utility isn't really utilized in a lot of the more contemporary content we have. Locha is still a skill point positive sustain that can consistently keep you alive, but he's simply fallen behind other units that we're going to be talking about very shortly. One such unit is the next sustain we received, and after taking a patch off to release Blade and Kafka's banner, the second half of the 1.3 patch of the game gave us the Quantum Preservation Short Queen Fujuan. Fujuan is actually a very unique sustain in that her primary means of keeping you alive isn't based on healing or shielding, which is really what both Abundance and Preservation as a class are kind of known for. Fujuan instead focuses on damage reduction, greatly reducing the amount of damage taken and then also redirecting most of that damage onto herself. She also does heal herself periodically to keep in the fight, and also did I mention she's short, because I think that's pretty relevant. On top of doing a pretty stellar job of keeping you alive and negating crowd control effects on allies once per skill use, she also provides a crit rate buff to allies, which can help you reach certain benchmarks to activate your planar set bonus, or just give you the extra crit rate you need to consistently crit when using a crit damage chest piece. It's at this point that Fujuan basically becomes the best overall sustain of the game, mostly on the merit of the fact that she provides some sort of utility aside from just keeping you alive, which most of these sustains can do, but she does more than just keep you alive. She also gives you, for instance, that crit rate buff, which is somewhat significant. But let's take a moment to go back to where we started. What about Natasha, the original healer in the game? Sure, she's not as useful as Fujuan, but she still has a niche, right? Pretty reliable healing, a cleanse, and if nothing else, she's free. Being free is a niche in and of itself, right? And everyone can use Natasha, so unless they just made a better sustain that was also free, I mean, she's got a role to play. So good for her. Anyway, let's move on to... Oh, wait, hold on. What's that on Fujuan's banner? Oh, right, it's Lynx. Lynx is the first 4-star sustain unit added to the game since release, and she just really does everything Natasha does, but better, and is also free, just like Natasha. Lynx cleanses the whole party on ult, which is much better than having to skill to cleanse a single party member. Now, Lynx doesn't break the game by any means, and in fact, you can reasonably use both her and Natasha as your 2 sustains and clear content. You would much rather have other sustains that can, give you some other buffs besides just healing you, but at the end, Lynx really does signal the end of a real use case for our original healer Natasha, because even in a completely free-to-play setting where you don't have access to premium units, you now have just a strictly better version of Natasha. Like I said, if you're going as free-to-play as possible, you could technically use one on one side of MOC and one on the other, but for the most part, Unless you have literally no other options, there's not much of a point in using our original healer at this point, but hey, it is what it is. She's a beginner unit. It's okay. It's at this point in writing this that I realized that I'm in patch 1.3, and I have a long way to go, meaning that this might be a bit of a long video, and also by writing about how long it is in the script, I'm only serving it to make it longer. Funny how that works, huh? It's kind of a metaphor for the futility of man's efforts, as no matter how much man struggles against the inevitable flow of time, we all succumb to death in the end anyway. Were we talking about gambling and video games? Right, let's do that. Anyway, after taking a patch off to release Jinglu and Topaz, as well as giving the game its first rerun with Zila coming back around, we reached the 1.5 version of the game, which once again changes the sustained landscape with the addition of Huohuo. There's some solid arguments you can make to say that Huohuo is still the best healer in the game today, but we'll get to that later. When she came out, she was the strongest healer without question, because much like Fuzhuan, she provides valuable buffs outside of just healing you or keeping you alive, and she doesn't have that stiff of competition really. Sorry, Lochua. Helping your team's energy issues and providing you a modest buff to your offensive capabilities, Huohuo is just kind of a cut above the other abundance units we've talked about up to this point, which once again makes her and Fuzhuan the two most prominent sustain options for your team in the 1.5 version of the game. And at this point, the game's rapidly approaching the 2.0 patch, and it's worth noting that the amount of sustains available is far smaller than the damage dealers. Even including the MC, there are only 4 preservation units in the game, period, and let's face it, March really doesn't work as a solo sustain. So you really only have Japard and Fuzhuan really on that side of things, and the abundance side it was a little more, well, abundant, but not by much. You have your old reliable Natasha, her replacement Lynx, the standard Bailu, the already forgotten Lochua, and the very reliable and valuable Huohuo. 9 units for 2 whole classes isn't a lot. They release 9 Nihility units a week. But one reason to explain this small amount of sustains, besides damage dealers and broken buffers just being easier to market, is the fact that with most of these units having very straightforward kits, it's kind of hard to make a new one without it feeling like an improvement or a redo of a previous unit. Lynx quite literally did this with Natasha, the only other 4-star abundance unit in the game. Power creep is an inevitable part of the game, but it's best to avoid it when we can, so what do? Hey, what's this guy do? Gallagher is the most recently released 4-star sustain unit, and he's a really cool guy. He not only feels conceptually very separate from the other abundance units, but also serves as a more specialized role, which from a design standpoint is a good measure to make power creep less obvious and less of an issue. Gallagher as a 4-star would go on to be the best in-slot healer for Acheron teams, which was convenient since he debuted on her banner, so good on you, Hoyo, you got that one right. Acheron relies on having as many debuffs as possible applied to enemies to quickly get her ultimate, and Gallagher providing a debuff makes him stand out amongst his contemporaries, and it's cool. And speaking of that debuff, the Besotted effect he applies, which is his debuff, is meant to support an archetype of team that didn't really exist when he came out, which is weakness break focused teams, which he would become then, once that developed into a more fleshed out team concept, he'd become the go-to healer for that team. Aside from this, Gallagher also takes a lot of actions due to the action advance present on his ultimate, and this allows him to be very good at saving you skill points. His overall healing potential and cleansing capabilities are far behind Huohuo, but in certain teams, he's simply the best option. So yeah, Gallagher is cool. Wish we got a new preservation unit though. I mean, we haven't had one of those since Fuzhuan. We don't really have, we haven't gotten a 4-star one really at all since launch. And
Bust.
you hear something?
Maybe I'll take it all.
We wouldn't have to wait too long after the Soda Man got released to get yet another sustain unit, and man, is he just the best one. Now, this is subjective, and I'm also biased because I like the character, but I think that Aventurine is the best overall sustain in the game. A much-needed Preservation 5-star since the category is so comedically thin with its roster size. Aventurine is a shielder that can easily keep you alive through thick and thin, providing a big shield on skill and topping that shield off with smaller shields every time you follow-up attacks. The Gambling Man can also provide some extra damage in the background with his follow-up attacks, which goes pretty well. And his follow-up attacks go off pretty often as well because you get hit a lot, especially when facing enemies that attack multiple allies at once. His ult applies a debuff after hitting an enemy, meaning he can also function in Acheron teams. This debuff just is pretty universally applicable as well, applying to everything except I guess Dot, because Dot doesn't crit, because his debuff just makes an enemy take more crit damage. Also, speaking of Acheron teams, there's a pretty available 4-star light cone that allows him to provide an additional debuff to enemies, which can make him an even better commodity when it comes to Acheron's debuff needing teams. So he had that niche in common with Gallagher. Aventurine's true calling is follow-up attack teams, working very well with all his co-workers at the IPC. What a great guy. You know, funnily enough, we're almost done. Despite the fact that sustain units take up 2 classes, we only have one more to talk about right now. Meanwhile, Hoyo is probably releasing yet another Nihilda unit in the time it's taking me to write this video. Oh wait, they did exactly that, huh? Okay, I'm pulling this one, so I can't be mad at it, but man, they really like Nihilda units, don't they? Anyway, there's still more to talk about when it comes to some of the units we've already discussed, but before we do, let's meet our final sustain, Lingsha. Lingsha is interesting for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that she's hot. I think that's an important reason. One of the other reasons is that technically she's kind of both a break unit and a follow-up attack unit. Much like her fellow Fire Element Abundance unit Gallagher, funny how that works, she also provides a break-focused debuff on foes. However, she heals more often and cleanses way more often. Also, being attack scaling healer, it's nice since you do a little bit more damage overall than if you scaled off of HP. Not that that fact helped Locha stay relevant at all. I'm still thinking about you, big guy. And her little cloud perfume bunny, I don't know what you want to call it, deals follow-up attack damage in the turn order, and it also heals and cleanses when it does. So that sounds pretty good, right? Well, before I tell you whether or not she beats out the competition, let's go over a couple interesting observations I have. First off, let's talk about 4-star preservation units, because Hoyo does not want to talk about 4-star preservation units. I don't know when we'll get a real 4-star preservation unit that can effectively solo sustain a team. I don't know to count the MC for this, because the MC's a 5-star, 4-star, whatever. They're free, so they probably should count, but let's not count the MC for a second. And I'm not counting March, because, once again, as much as I love the character, March is one of my favorite characters in the game. With everything dangerous dealing party-wide or blast damage, her shield's just not going to cut it. That's if they even target the shield. Her taunt does work on the shield, but they don't always fall for it, so you might shield something and then that thing just doesn't get attacked. I don't really know what a 4-star preservation unit that actually works would look like right now, but the 2 times they've opted to release 4-star sustains since they launched the game, they've definitely chosen to do abundance units because they don't know what they're going to do for a 4-star preservation unit. Speaking of releasing new units, it's also kind of funny that they alternate which sustain class they release for 5 stars. We start with the Abundance unit Lochua, then the Preservation Fujuan, Abundance Woho, back to the Amber Lord with Aventurine, and of course finally back to Abundance with Lingsha. Just think that's funny. I don't know. If that pattern consists, then I guess the next sustain 5-star will be a Preservation, but they definitely need to release more Fire Nihilda units first, because we just don't have enough of those. It's also worth noting that it just kind of seems like with the 2 basic duties that a sustain unit has, keeping you from getting debuffed and keeping you alive, they do this very differently within the 2 classes, which makes sense because they're different classes. Obviously, we know that abundance units tend to heal, and preservation units focus on not taking damage in the first place, or taking less damage, I guess, in the case of Fujuan. But also, it's worth noting that when it comes to cleansing, that's mostly an abundance unit thing. For instance, March is a preservation unit and can cleanse, but we don't talk about her that much because, once again, she can't really solo sustain. Aventurine prevents you from getting debuffed or CC'd by just giving you a bunch of effect res and hoping that's enough. Fujuan prevents you from getting CC'd by just preventing you from getting CC'd once per skill use. So I think that's kind of interesting how the 2 classes do the secondary duty of a sustain unit differently. I just think that's kind of neat. Anyway, enough of that nonsense. With everyone assembled, where do we stand? Looking at the state of sustains as a whole, has power creep killed them? Is everyone viable? Why are there so many Nihilda units? Well, we can answer 2 of those questions right now. I would say the power creep has really done pretty negligible damage, ironically, to the classes that make you take less damage. Funny how that works. This is in part because, while the additional offensive utility of later units is a helpful bonus, it's just that, a bonus. Now, some units really do want these premium units in their team. And that being said, while you can use Natasha and Lynx, you obviously have far better options. The good news is, the answer to which option is best depends a lot on your team, which is a good thing. This means no one sustain just stands head and shoulders above the rest. Aventurine is the best sustain for follow-up-centric teams. Lingsha and Gallagher are both excellent in break teams, and while Lingsha offers more personal damage and more consistent heals and cleanse, Gallagher is a much better skill point generator and can still outshine her if you need the extra skill points for your damage dealers or buffers. Need energy and attack? Run Woho. Need crit rate? Run Fujuan. I guarantee you all these units I just named can still be the best unit for a specific team in a specific circumstance. I guarantee you all these units that I just named have situations where they can be the best for your team. As for the others, Lynx, Japard, Bailu, Natasha, and or Lochua, they can still hold the line and keep you alive, even though they may not have a specific niche where they can be just the absolute best. They can still get the job done and keep you alive. Even March can, make sure your Clara or your Yun Li are getting hit. kinda, even though Lynx does a better job of that. But yeah, that's where sustain units started from and where they are now. Of course, Linkshot just came out this patch, so we haven't had her for very long, and maybe we'll have a new preservation unit on the horizon sometime soon. Probably after we get another several Nihilda units, because once again, they're everywhere. I really would like another 4-star preservation unit just to see what they would do. Maybe have them buff dot damage, since dot hasn't gotten anything at all recently. But that about wraps things up. I kind of decided to write this on a whim, so thanks for taking the time to listen. If you think it'd be interesting to see something like this for other character classes, then let me know below. If you think I missed an important detail at some point that really is crucial to the story of how sustains have evolved, then let me know that as well, and thanks for watching. Like, comment, Subway sandwich,